Hello again, I am Blunty, and before we begin in earnest, I want to use the YouTube Thumbs as a MacGyver polling system today. If you are, or personally know, and I mean in real life personally know, someone with autism or a neurodivergency with shared traits, like for example ADHD, I want you to pop a thumbs up. If you aren't aware of anyone in your immediate life who is autistic or similar, hit the thumbs down button. I kind of want to get a sense of which section of the audience I'm talking loudest to here with this kind of stuff. So, with you nice folk doing that for me, let's talk about the meltdown that I had in public. And not just in public, but at a public event, PAX Australia. Australia's biggest gaming expo, which sees about 80,000 of my fellow nerds walk through the doors over its 3-day expo. Now, regular viewers around here might already know this, especially those of you who journey over to Twitch for my weekend live streams there, where it comes up a bit more frequently than the more curated content I make for YouTube here. But I am autistic. Or if you're someone who insists on what's called person-first framing language, I'm a guy with autism. I might circle back to that argument a little later in the video, or maybe a whole separate video, because it bugs the absolute shit out of me. For my purposes, and my perspective, and the way I like to say it, I'm autistic. I'm not with autism, but I generally say I have autism. I am autistic. And while there's still a tremendous amount of ignorance and simple misunderstanding out there about what autistic folk experience in the regular day-to-day shit, it's probably safe to assume that most people out there these days know one of the more common traits: sensitivity to sensory input, especially in loud, crowded places with lots of people shuffling around in a din of light and noise. The stereotype most often seen in media especially might be an autistic child having a screaming, thrashing tantrum in the middle of a shopping centre. Oh, how embarrassing for the parent. Oh, it's terrible. Now, it's crucial at this point that I explain, or at least remind you, that autism as a diagnosis is a constellation of traits and symptoms, and these symptoms and traits can be more or less pronounced in individuals. It is not a monolithic checklist. The way I experience autism is different to someone else's experience of autism. There's a wonderfully cute little diagram I want to show you here that I often see posted on social media when I search tags like actually autistic and things like that, but I think it does a great job of visually explaining how this works. There's no such thing as severely or very autistic and slightly autistic or just a little bit autistic. We all just have a different recipe, and certain recipes of these ingredients can mean some of us have more specific or higher support needs, and some of us can, with at least a little bit of effort, pretty much stealth ourselves into at least appearing typical. This is called masking, and it's fucking exhausting. So, now, when I say it's a stereotype that autistic people can be extremely sensitive to overstimulation in bright and loud and busy environments, I mean only that this is something most neurotypical people immediately associate with autism, and that's largely thanks to the extremely limited representation we get in movies and TVs and such, a topic for another time perhaps, but it's quite frustrating. And the same thing goes for autistic meltdowns. The immediate thought for most people, it seems, at least those I've talked to about this, is the screaming and thrashing and the uncontrollable tantrum. And hopefully, by the end of this video, I'll have dispelled that as a universal truth as well. Because while some autistic people can indeed have extreme, perhaps even violent meltdowns, with all the thrashing and screaming indeed, but that is by far not the only truth to it. And when I say sensory overstimulation, I need you to understand it. I'm not talking about us having extra sensitive senses. It's not a superpower. Those little cute t-shirts you see parents of autistic kids put them in. Oh, I'm autistic, what's your superpower? I hate those. I think it's the wrong framing. My hearing, for example, is not above average in any way. It's not superheroic hearing. It's not extra sensitive in any way. You can probably hear everything I can hear. The difference is in what my brain does with what my ears detect. My ears are the functional sensors. My brain processes that information. How your brain processes that information is different to how my brain does it. That is the difference in autism when it comes to sensory input. And on top of that, not all autistic people are sensitive in the same ways, or to the same inputs, or to the same severity. But I'm here today to talk about my experience, my lived experience. So in my case, I am frequently extremely sensitive to noise in particular, but bright light, olfactory, and tactile sensitivity are also occasionally issues for me to greater or lesser extents. How sensitive I am to them and which sensory inputs are the biggest issues can in fact vary and shift over time. I'm not always as sensitive to sound as I am in other times. And let's take smell, for example. While I'm often distracted by unexpected smells, making it hard to focus, like the smell of my neighbour's cooking wafting in through an open window or something, it can make it hard to focus on what I'm doing because all I'm thinking about is what they're cooking and how they're cooking. Oh, is that frying onions I smell? Ooh. It's almost never a trigger for anxiety for me, though. Bright lights, even simply being outside on a bright day, is often uncomfortable, and as counterintuitive as it can seem, that amount of light can often make it hard for me to see at all, or at least focus on what I'm seeing, but again, usually not a cause for anxiety, just kind of moderate inconvenience really, but it can on occasion be problematic, particularly when compiled with my more common acute sensitivity, noise. If I'm having a bad day with noise and there's a lot of light around, that can kind of stack on top of it and make things worse. And that is what got me at PAX. Day one went largely without issue. I took a few small breaks here and there when I started feeling a bit overwhelmed by it all, when I started to feel myself increasingly anxious and unable to focus on what I was trying to do, or someone I was trying to have a conversation with. I was finding it more and more difficult to, listen to their words. But by and large, it went fine, quite smoothly. On day two, I felt the rumbles. The rumbles is a term some autistic people use to describe the feeling of a building meltdown, an impending meltdown, the shadow of a meltdown, or indeed a shutdown. I'll explain those two terms as we go. Now, it often takes years of rather bitter experience, learning enough self-awareness and the ability to pull out with enough perspective to reliably get a sense of when you're reaching the tipping point of a meltdown, to develop the rumble sense, if you will. And it's difficult because the path to a meltdown it's like a rolling snowball. It starts small and slow, but it gathers speed and mass as it rolls and collects ever more snow. And at some point, it is just too big to stop. And the only thing that can happen is it smashes into something with the force of an avalanche and explodes in an all-encompassing and blinding mist of white, drowning out everything in sight. Or at the very least, that's one of the better metaphors I've tried to use to describe this feeling. In truth, for me at least, it's vastly more turbulent than a growing snowball and not nearly as steady in build-up. It can be slow or fast and flip between the two and seem to steady off for a bit and then whoa, all of a sudden it's all over you. But the snowball thing is easy to visualize, so we'll stick with that. And sometimes you don't see it, you don't notice how big and how fast the snowball is getting until it's too late to even stop it. And that's what happened to me on day 2 of PAX Australia. I felt the rumbles clear enough. I was on a constant vigilance for them. I was extra sort of aware of trying to keep tabs on how I was feeling about all this. Thanks to the world event, it had been 3 years since I'd been able to go to a public event like this, and I was quite out of practice with my normal tools and coping mechanisms that I used to get through them and enable me to properly enjoy the experience. So I was being a little extra paranoid about how things were going in that regard. By mid-afternoon on day 2, the snowball started to threaten. My rumble sense was tingling. I noticed it, I thought, in time. And rather welcomely, the people who run PAX have learned that a statistically significant portion of their target audience have a need of somewhere to escape the relentless din for various reasons, including issues like mine. So they have what they call their AFK room, a gamer term for gamer people. I think it's quite cute. AFK, for those bewilderingly on this channel but ignorant of some basic gamer culture acronyms, means away from keyboard, taking a break. The AFK room at PAX this year was 2 conjoining rooms. One was a calm space, tables and chairs staffed by volunteers and supplied with quiet activity stuff like puzzles and supplies for origami and even colouring books. And as infantilizing as that can sound, small, quiet, simple tasks like this can be a big help to people who can use them as a near meditative tool for focusing their mind down to a single calm task. There is often a big problem in infantilization in autism and things like that, but yeah, this is kind of an exception to that. These things are genuinely useful to a lot of us. Now, personally, I don't tend to find them especially useful, so I just sat quietly in the room and tried to focus on, well, I guess in keeping with the metaphor I've been using, focusing on slowing down the snowball. As for the other adjoining room, I'll tell you about that later on in the story. Sadly, I wasn't having a lot of success in the AFK room. I did calm down a bit. Annoyingly, it actually accidentally left my Fidget gadget at home. It's a new one, I just got it. 2 heavy metal discs joined with a kind of clicky magnet-driven rotating action in the middle there. It looks like an Oreo cookie, and I quite like it. It feels pretty good to fiddle with. I'll put an Amazon link in the down below if you want one for yourself. But the point is, I'd accidentally left it behind, and without it, it seems my need for tactile stimming fell to my camera controls. I hadn't really noticed I was doing it until one of the room staff pointed it out, but I was constantly clicking away at one of the function wheels on the camera. It's one of the things I actually like about heavily tactile control wheels on my cameras: impromptu fidget gadgets. Stimming, if it's a term you have not come across before, is a self-stimulating behavior. It's not exclusive to autistics by any means, but it is extremely common amongst us, and it can be many things, from fiddling with an object in repeatable patterns, clapping, snapping your fingers, full body rocking, any number of things. But for me, I have a few of my favourite fidget devices. Sometimes I'll roll a coin around in my fingers if I can't get to my fidget thingies. Sometimes when I'm standing, I'll rock side to side from foot to foot. Sometimes it's other things. A welcome fact in the AFK room that day is I found someone from my own community, a regular viewer and supporter in fact, was already in the room. And it was comforting to have someone familiar there instead of a room of half a dozen strangers. We don't know each other extremely well, to be fair. We're not best buds or anything, but she was familiar and has been for years now, I suppose. And I already knew her to be a kind and warm individual. So that made me quite comfortable to see her there. And it was only made better by the fact that her service dog was there, Scout, who might be the most sensitive of puppas I've ever met. I'd already fallen a little bit in love with this fluffy mug earlier that day, when at his owner's request he sat for a selfie with me. But here in the AFK room, he would frequently come over to me, giving me a little nudge with his nose and licking at my hands and maneuvering under my hand to let me pet him. Now, this is not something service dogs do with random people when they're working. They're trained very, very specifically not to do that, as it could distract them from their duty to their owner's needs. And on that point, if you've never been told this before, please do not ever try to play with or even pet a working service dog unless specifically invited to do so by their owner. They often have a special command especially for this, to let the dog know that it's okay. That approval was, of course, given earlier that day when I sat down for the photo with the pupper. But not so when I was in the AFK room. So it might be projection, or the human instinct to personify animals, but Scout's behaviour towards me, especially compared to the other people in the room I observed of him as he sort of wandered around and checked out who was coming and going, it was different with me. He wasn't just scoping me out, he chose to interact with me in a very specific way, and a repeated way. And, imagined or not, I very much like to think that he was trying to help me, and he did. But even with the power of sweetheart pupper compassion and the AFK room, it seems I was too slow to act. The snowball was already too big, too fast, and despite my own efforts and even Scout's, I eventually hit a point of meltdown. One of the issues was the AFK room opened directly onto the main show floor, which made it very easy to find and very fast to get to for those who needed it, but also meant every single time the large powered sliding door opened to let someone in or out, the show floor noise poured in with them, along with the uneven hiss of the door's own electric operation and the clack of its big green activation button. This is some of what I mean, by the way, when I talk about how my brain processes sound versus what a typical brain does. To most people, the noise of the door, the clack of its button, even the ebb and flow of the show floor noise as the door opens and closes, it's just background noise. They're aware of it, but only insofar as they're aware of the floor they're standing on. They're not really conscious or thinking about it. Now, I hear the exact same things, but my brain doesn't filter or prioritize the sensory input in the same way. I kind of have to manually process it if I'm trying to, say, listen to someone talking. It's work for my brain to do. It's active, deliberate work. The mumbles of conversation from the other table, the door switch and the sound of it opening, the marker on the paper as someone draws, the occasional bubble of the drinking water fountain, the din of the show floor, the music in the background, the noise of dozens of games, the trample of hundreds of feet, the sound of someone shifting in their chair, the soft noise of the person sitting right next to me sifting through their puzzle pieces. I get it all, and I have to sort through it. Nothing is background noise to me as it comes in. And that's just one of my senses. And yeah, it's hard, but usually I've got a pretty good handle on it. But sometimes I just can't keep up anymore, and the snowball starts to gather. But even in the AFK room, it came to a point that I started to physically flinch every time that door opened, the way someone might flinch at a car unexpectedly backfiring. It was a shock to the system every time. I dreaded the sound of that door starting to open because I knew what was coming next. And eventually, but quite suddenly and acutely, it hit. The meltdown. I physically crumpled, hands went tight, fists, eyes squeezed shut, jaw clenched, my whole body tightened up, my head went down, trying very, very hard to muffle my instinct to vocalize because I didn't want to startle or scare anyone else nearby who was trying to utilize the AFK room. I don't recall doing it, but I'm told I was also tapping the back of my head with my hand, a stimming behavior that is uncommon for me. I don't know if I've ever done it before, but yeah, I was this time apparently. Eventually, it started to pass, and I honestly have no idea if I was like that for 1 minute or 10 minutes or 15 minutes. I can't track anything when that happens. When the meltdown comes, nothing processes properly, certainly not time. Nothing filters. Every light, every sound, every touch, every smell, every voice becomes a crashing din, and it hurts. But as I guess the word is surfaced again, I noticed 3 people around me, all with very worried looks on their faces. I don't know what I looked like from the outside in, but apparently it was quite concerning. I remember mumbling something about hoping I didn't freak them all out, and briefly trying to explain, I think rather poorly, that I was having a very hard time filtering noise. And to be honest with you guys, I felt pretty embarrassed. I've grown used to being more open about being autistic and talking about it, and all that kind of stuff, but I never feel more vulnerable, more like an open wound than when someone sees me not just at a point of weakness, but at the breaking point. It's not often I have a meltdown like that in public. And from the outside looking in, I'm sure it's very, very disconcerting, especially if you have no context for what I'm going through in the first place. So I feel a bit weird about feeling embarrassed about it because it's not something I control. It's not something I'm chosen to do. It's just a medical fact of the way my brain works sometimes. So I don't know if the embarrassment is some self-preservation, a protective measure, or it might be some leftover toxic masculinity for showing vulnerability in public. I don't know. All I know is it's hard to process that kind of feeling. Like I said, this kind of meltdown is rare for me. More often than not, I see its counterpart, the shutdown. And that's what happened next. Now, after I had somewhat recovered some basic human functionality, one of the volunteers scrambled away and came back with some foam earplugs. She said something about not knowing if they would help. I honestly couldn't really focus on her words yet because I wasn't quite all the way back. But I thanked her and I explained that those kind of earplugs don't really work for me because they feel too weird. The physical sensory input of having these things jammed in my ears is, it's kind of defeats the purpose, really. Once my body started to obey me properly once more, I took myself to the adjoining room. This one was labelled the quiet room. Through its door was a room with all the lights turned off, save for one of those laser star-filled projectors they had pointing at the ceiling, some tables and chairs, floor space enough to lay down on, and a few beanbag chairs around the walls. I just laid down flat on the floor. I tried my best to run through some meditative techniques, steady my breathing, center my thoughts. But one of the 4 walls of said room was a series of glass panels, and on the other side of those glass panels was the show floor. The glass panels predictably did a rather poor job of dulling the noise, which did not help in my efforts. Only one path remained, having failed every other attempt. I just had to leave. I had to get the hell out of there while I could. By this time, I'd been in the AFK room for, I guess, about 90 minutes or so. It had helped, but not enough to return to the expo proper. but hopefully enough to get back to the hotel room. The journey back to the hotel room was horrible. Honestly, I recall few specific details except being miserable, and the unrelenting noise of the city, and the single reoccurring thought of just wanting to get back to my hotel room. I just have to get back to the hotel room. I just have to make it back to the hotel room. I just have to make it back to the hotel room. My brain was in survival mode. The only thing I could concentrate on was my breathing. A deeper part of me autopiloted the rest of the meat puppet. It'd be quite disconcerting if it wasn't so interesting, but I honestly don't remember the journey back to the hotel room. I do remember stepping inside the hotel room. The room was cool and dark and very, very quiet, thankfully. I rested and indeed recovered enough to go out again and meet up with a friend for dinner that evening. I was still a bit fragile and quite mentally exhausted, but I was okay. I was functional. I was me enough again. The third and final day of PAX Australia was much the same as the last two. Noise, people, fun, lovely. I had missed this stuff quite a bit more than I thought I did. I mean, I knew I missed it, but oh man, I got a lot out of the weekend. You know, even with the meltdown and the shutdown I'm about to tell you about, it's so worth it. But only a few hours into day 3, and I felt the rumble again. But it came fast this time, and it felt urgent. The stress of the sensory overload's speed, coupled with the anxiety of potentially having a meltdown right there in the middle of the crowd, all compounded on top of itself, and a true panic set in. The heart rate spiked and I struggled to control my breathing. A panic attack was now racing a meltdown. And yes, they are quite distinct things, by the way. They feel very different. So, for example, if you've had panic attacks before, and by hearing the story you think you might know what a meltdown feels like, it's not quite the same thing. So anyway, I beelined for the AFK room. As imperfect as it was better than nothing, and it was, at the very least, closer than some other quiet spaces I've mapped out over the years and keep in mind for when I'm at this venue and am facing this problem. This time, though, I went straight for the quiet room, and I sat in the corner furthest away from the door and those glass walls. This time when I went in there, though, on the table in the center of the room, there were several pairs of ear defenders. I don't recall seeing them there the day before, and they weren't offered to me when the earplugs were, so I wondered if these were bought in at the request of the volunteer who did offer me those foam earplugs yesterday. I did think I saw a flash of helplessness on her face when her attempt to help me was fruitless, so... But even in the remotest, darkest corner, and even with those ear defenders on, enough of the noise bled through that I found it hard to calm down. I'd never used this kind of ear defender before. Normally, I use active noise-cancelling headphones, so I'm not sure how much noise these things are designed to cut out, but it was less than I'd hoped. But at least this time, small mercies, I escaped the brutality of a meltdown. I did, however, flip to the other side of that coin. The shutdown. Now, from the outside, a shutdown is easy to describe. The subject having the shutdown will withdraw, go quiet, be largely or entirely unresponsive to the outside world. They won't engage or respond to verbal or physical prompts. Doesn't matter what you say to them. You can tap them on the arm, ask them if they're okay. They're not going to respond to you. It's a protective response, like an echidna rolling into a ball when feeling threatened by a predator. From the outside in, it's probably a lot easier to understand than a meltdown is. From the inside, it's a lot harder to describe in a way that'll make sense to most people. Everything kind of gets dulled, washed out, faded, but not quite. It's not like falling asleep. It's not like being anesthetized. It's not like being intoxicated. It's not like meditation either, but that's probably closer, except meditation is guided, focused, deliberate. Shutting down is completely involuntary. And it's not dark or bright. It's not numbness or awareness. It's so hard to describe because my brain isn't doing anything to record what it feels like when this happens. So when I try to think back about how it felt, there's nothing there in the memory. A shutdown is kind of like your brain trying to reboot, like you would with a computer when some programs won't shut down on their own or properly, or when something is using up all the CPU power and just won't stop doing that. You have to reboot the computer. I mean, it's not that, but it's about as close a metaphor as I can manage. You're not really rebooting and you're not really unconscious or unaware, but you're also not processing much at all from the outside. It's like instead of even trying to process any input, because the brain goes, nope, that's all too much, and it doesn't try to stack it into a big to-do pile or to sort through or to get to it. The brain just shunts everything coming in into a void instead. Like just everything coming in, it just goes right to the void. The only thing I really specifically remember is the shallow breathing and kind of dim vision as I come back in a way that is entirely unlike waking up from sleep. Again, it's crazy hard to describe because your brain isn't really recording it properly. It's really weird, but not as disconcerting as you'd think because usually you start feeling a lot better, albeit quite exhausted, pretty quickly. And that's kind of a relief. Much like a meltdown, a shutdown also kind of shit-cans my sense of time passing, so I'm not really sure how long I spent as human-shaped furniture. I remember being vaguely aware of people moving around and people coming in and out of a door, but that's about it. But I did, I did surface and I felt better. I stayed in the room a little while longer, fiddling with a Batman Forever Pog Slimer my best mate had given me the evening before. It wasn't my ideal fidget toy, but it was something. And after a little while, my friends came to collect me and we went to lunch. It did take me another maybe 30 minutes or so to stop flinching at bright lights or the noise of the food court we passed through on the way to lunch, but I did get back to normal enough by the time we'd finished eating our fancy pizzas. And I guess that's it. The end of story. And the story of my first public meltdown in quite some time. Hopefully along the way here I've helped wash away a little ignorance, but most of all, I hope those of you who've had similar lived experiences see that you're not alone, because once upon a time, I felt pretty alone with this stuff, and it sucked. So I guess thank you for listening, and hopefully thank you for understanding or attempting to. And if you've not left a comment yet, can I get a good boy Scout in the comments, because Scout is the goodest of boys. Thank you for watching. I am Blunty, and I will catch you next time.